everyone. Good evening and welcome to our author talk tonight. Tonight we are really excited to welcome Max Gross, the author of The Lost Shtetl. Just a little bit about Max. He was born in New York City in 1978, and he's the son of two writers. He attended St. Anne's School in Brooklyn and went to Dartmouth College and worked for 10 years at The Forward and the New York Post before becoming the editor-in-chief of Commercial Observer. He previously wrote a book about dating called From Schlub to Stud, but has since been rescued from the single man's fate by his beloved wife and son. They live in Queens, New York, and The Lost Shtetl is his first novel. And we are thrilled to welcome you here tonight, Max, and I'm going to just turn things straight over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Mendelson. I really appreciate it. I am, I should say, really excited about tonight. Before I get into my novel, The Lost Shtetl, I would just like to say this has been on the books since last summer. I've been waiting for this and waiting for this and waiting for this. I'm only disappointed that it's not in person. I wanted to talk a little bit about the origins of this book. And so if you'll permit me, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my first job in journalism, which was at the Forward newspaper, which you mentioned. I wasn't quite there for 10 years. I was there for less than that. I think combined with the New York Post, it was about 10 years. I was at the Forward, and I had what I like to call the freak beat when I was there. I was the reporter they put on. I wasn't covering politics. I wasn't covering education. I wasn't covering Jewish charities. I wasn't covering Israel. I was covering the weird stuff that came in. So I stumbled upon this website called Jews for Allah, which was essentially an attempt to do what Moshe Rosen did in the 1970s when he started Jews for Jesus, except for Islam. And I went out to Bethel, Connecticut for the afternoon and listened to the founder's spiel. I did stories about the invention of the flagel, the flat bagel. I did stories about Aguna protests, which is a big thing in the ultra-Orthodox community. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these. I did stories about Mel Brooks and competitive gefilte fish eating competitions, which are way more disgusting than they sound like. I did a story about a Dybbuk haunted wine cabinet that was being auctioned off on eBay. And one of the more popular stories that I did was a story that took place in New Square, New York, which is an ultra-Orthodox Hasidic square town, about an hour or so outside of the city. And maybe it was a perm prank, who knows what it was. The story was that one day a fish in the fish market there, a carp, looked up at the guy who was about to fillet him and started speaking in Hebrew and claimed that he was the transmogrified soul of a guy who had lived in the town who had died a few years ago. And the fish jumped into a pile of other fish before it could be isolated and interrogated about this wild happenstance. And I heard the rumor about this. One of the reporters from the Yiddish Forward told me that this rumor was traveling from New Square to Brooklyn to Toronto, all through the Square community. And I took the bus up to New Square, and I remember I had this feeling as I stepped off the bus that I was stepping into a very strange replanted shtetl. I didn't see any, straw roofs. I didn't see dirt roads. But if you wanted to live shtetl life with modern architecture and an SUV instead of, a horse and cart, this was it. And I remember I walked past the street. There was literally a flock of geese that passed in front of me. And there's an old Tom Wolfe rule of reporting that he would show up at a NASCAR race in a dressed in a dapper white suit, because he knew that looking like you would try to fit in would always look phony. Um, that if you um, wanted to get people to open up to you, you had to really look like yourself. They could, sniff out a fake. And I did not know this rule at the time. So I showed up trying to look as Jewish as possible. I am Jewish, of course, but and I never wear a yarmulke. I wore a yarmulke. I, tried to, say, hey, everybody, hello. And it was completely obvious that I was a fraud. And this was the days before smartphones, so I just sort of had to ask around, where the fish market was, and nobody was interested in helping me. Everybody who spoke to me did so in like these little one-word answers, and this was about 18 years ago or so, but I still just remember the face of one woman who just stared at me without response when I asked her, "Had you heard of the, talking fish?" And I remember thinking something similar, visiting some of the Hasidic neighborhoods of Brooklyn, like Borough Park. They were isolated in their little bubble shtetls. They're incorporated into New York City and to the subway system almost by accident. And to a certain extent, it was those kinds of shtetls that were in my thinking when I began constructing the town of Kreskol that's at the center of my book, The Lost Shtetl. A long time ago, I remember reading a passage from Saul Belloh's book, To Jerusalem and Back. Rabbi Mendelson and I were talking about Saul Bellow before we started. And this was his travel log to Israel. And he's talking about being on an airplane sitting next to a young Hasidic guy. And he has to explain to this guy what a mathematician is and who Albert Einstein was. And for those of you who have read my book, you'll know that I ripped off a little piece of that when my protagonist Yankel is in the hospital and is in the mental hospital, and the doctors ask him if he knows who Shakespeare's Hamlet is, and he says, "Hamlet who?" Not knowing who Albert Einstein was, it felt like the kind of thing that was impossible in 1976 when the book was published, and it feels impossible today. But in my travels, in my reporting, in my life, I've met a lot of people who left Hasidism who told me just how shunned American life was. Their first language was Yiddish, and their birthday was the 2nd of Kislev, not November 18th. And they didn't own a television or a computer. On the other hand, I knew plenty of them who did own a computer. And pre-pandemic, I would go, I'm a horrible, degenerate poker player. I would go to some of the Brooklyn underground poker rooms once the sun went down on a Saturday night. And the rooms would be filled with Hasidim. And I know plenty of them who left that life because they were seduced by everything else that's on display in modern life. And those are some of the themes I was writing about in The Lost Shtetl as well. My book is about a little village of Jews in a lonely corner of Poland that's so isolated and hermetic, excuse me, that it's completely overlooked in the Holocaust and the Cold War and the democratic transition until we stumble on them in the here and now. And to a certain extent, The Lost Shtetl is a time travel book. It's about a village from the past that steps into the present after all this unimaginable tumult and change of the 20th century, and everything is baffling to the villagers. But I also think it's a work about alienation and the battle between the acceptance of modernity and technology and the rejection. I very much believe that a lot of people, Jews and Gentiles both, live a very cloistered life. I think that this was something that was happening for many years before the pandemic, but I think it's been greatly heightened because of it. I'm not certain how isolation is changing us as a culture. I think it's probably a much subtler transformation than we appreciate right now. But I do think that isolation is one of the great questions about life in 2021. Every one of us right now is sitting, in their homes in front of a piece of steel and silicon and plastic and bauxite. And in my opinion, this has done two things. I think it's made life possible during the pandemic. Millions and millions of people were able to work from home because of Zoom, and send in their work over the computer, and this saved lives, it saved jobs, it saved treasure, throughout the world. We could order food online rather than go to the market, and back when the pandemic was raging, I think this, probably saved a lot of people's lives. And we had Netflix, and that kept us distracted these many months, and that preserved a certain amount of sanity. So I think that that's an unquestionably good thing. And yet I've been highly ambivalent and sometimes, quite disgusted with the obsession that we have with technology as a culture. Well prior to the pandemic, I'd go out to dinner with friends, and you see four people sitting at a table, sharing a meal together, and every one of us, myself included, had their phone out. And that to me felt like a very isolating thing. I feel like for myself, it's like I'm hypnotized. I have a 6-year-old son. These are the precious poetic years of his life, and I choose to spend them, gnashing my teeth because of something idiotic on Twitter. And I find myself anxious and depressed. I find that I'm much happier when I'm not online and worrying about the immediacy of every last thing. And that is something that I think I'm writing about in the Lost Shtetl. I think there is no right answer for this. I think that there are real advantages and disadvantages, but I don't think we've examined them in depth as a culture. So, broadly speaking, those are some of the themes that I'm writing about. But more specifically, there's the town of Kreskol. It's been there for hundreds of years. The novel begins with an acrimonious divorce between Pesha Lindauer, who's the heroine of this book, and her husband Ishmael. One of them goes missing from the town, and then the other one. And the rabbis of Kreskol feel that they have to elevate this to the Gentiles. So they send out a mamzer, Yankel Lewenkopf, who's the hero of the story, to the nearest city. And when Yankel gets there and he starts talking about his little shtetl in the forest, not only does nobody believe him, but they stick him in a mental hospital. And eventually they figure out that Yankel is telling the truth and decide that they have to find Kreskol and reintegrate it into contemporary Poland. And I'm going to start reading from that point. And one thing you should know before I start the reading is that this is a little bit of a flashback. We saw the rediscovery of this town once before. And when the villagers of Kreskol see a helicopter land in the center of town, they think it's the Messiah coming in from heaven. So I am going to start in a second. So this takes place in the mental hospital when they've decided that Yankel is in fact telling the truth. Dr. Babiak took it upon herself to make the first call to the governor and felt silly explaining it to the administrator who answered the phone. There's a secret shtetl filled with Jews which survived the war, Dr. Babiak said when she was asked about what the call was about. There's no danger so far as we know. They're all living just as they always did, but we thought we should tell somebody about it. The other end of the line was silent for several moments before the secretary spoke. What's a shtetl? And while the hospital spent months dithering to and fro, The wheels of government moved surprisingly rapidly. Several deputies called back, and the governor himself got on the phone a few hours later. He apparently believed that this little village had the potential to become a big media story, a modern day Brigadoon, if you will, and everyone should be prepared. An elderly Yiddish translator was summoned from Warsaw, and several government officials descended on Our Lady of Mercy Hospital to interview the various parties involved. When they were satisfied that no hoaxes were being pulled, it was agreed that the government had a duty to visit Kreskol and welcome it to its rightful place in contemporary Polish society. The only thing left to do is actually locate Kreskol, said Raymond Sikorsky, the slight middle-aged official the Voivodeship had sent to Our Lady of Mercy. We will take a helicopter over the forest tomorrow. Excuse me. The helicopter took off from the outskirts of town and landed in the center of Kreskol the next day, and Yankel, who had left town as an expendable, acceptable loss in the course of finding the truly important people, was suddenly thrust into a heretofore unimaginable position of authority and wisdom. The people of Kreskol had gathered in a crowd the size of which Yankel had never seen before. They stared in stupefaction. They wept. And for the moment, Yankel was as puzzled as the Gentiles. Then he heard one of the townspeople look at the translator and cry, Moshiach. The throngs followed suit, shouting, Moshiach, 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 over and over. For not the first time since he had left home months earlier, he realized just how simple and artless the people he left behind were, the poor souls. Of course, 3 months ago, Yankel would have no doubt had the same reaction. What is going on here, the rabbi asked. Is this the Messiah? And Yankel began to explain what I have recounted a few chapters earlier. After the initial shock had worn off somewhat, it was decided that the succeeding business should be conducted in a less public setting. Who are these people? Rabbi Sokolow asked Yankel after the trio had been trotted into his study and examined by the old and esteemed of Kreskol. The younger and less educated were crammed into Rabbi Sokolow's hallway, each with their ears pointed to the rabbi's oak door, eager to hear miraculous news for themselves. This man is Raymond Sikorsky, Yankel said, introducing the short, bespectacled Gentile with the receding hairline who carried with him the aura of leadership. He is with the Voivodeship. And who is he? Rabbi Sokolow asked, pointing to the aged, shrunken Jew who had jumped out of the chariot with the Gentile. His name is Jared something, Yankel replied. He's here to translate. Rabbi Sokolow looked as if he tried to weigh his words before he spoke, anxious not to offend anyone's sensibilities, particularly one who might have the imprimatur of holiness. So he's not the Messiah, Rabbi Sokolow asked. The translator chuckled softly to himself. No, I'm not anybody important, he ventured in Yiddish. A more worldly observer would place his accent in Riga. He then gestured to the Gentile chieftain. He's the important one, which were largely the last words he would speak for himself. Good people of Kreskol, the translator said a few moments later for the chieftain, I'm here to fill you in on everything you might have missed. Yes, we missed a lot. I have sometimes lost track of what Sikorsky told us that afternoon and what we learned later over the next few months, but the fundamentals of the last century were recounted. World War II, the Cold War, the creation of the State of Israel, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, a man on the moon, the eradication of polio, the instant coffee powder, even if normal coffee was an unfamiliar commodity in these parts. When Sikorsky spoke about World War II, he was determined that we would not be left with the same doubts as Yankel Lewinkov. He produced 11 photographs, which he placed on the rabbi's wooden desk for each man to examine for himself. Millions died, the Gentile explained, pointing to the glossy, black and white images of Babi Yar, Auschwitz, and Treblinka. Poland was almost completely cleansed of Jews. As he said the word cleansed, the Gentile's face changed color, as if he had accidentally said something impolite. And that is all I will read for today.
So do you want me to open things up to questions?
It's your show, Rabbi Mendelson, so I will do whatever you like.
Okay, sounds good. So I want to see if you have a question, you can raise your hand or or let me know in the chat box. I wanted to just start off by saying, like, I enjoyed this book so much, and I said to you earlier, it really gave me so much to think about, and you put a lot into this book. So my first question is, in some ways, this you have, somebody said earlier that it's kind of like two books in one book. You have two different like storylines kind of running at this. I mean, you actually have, in some ways, there are several different threads running through the book, but if you were going to just say the stories of, Pesha, Ishmael, and Yankel are kind of like one book in some ways, and then the story of what happens in Kreskol could be another. Um, why did you decide to do it that way? Was it just to help you move the story forward? How would you compare, kind of the journey that Kreskol goes on with the journeys of, those three characters?
Well, that's an interesting question. I always thought that the book had to be a mosaic. I think that when you're talking about a town, it gives you a real opportunity to tell multiple stories. And I really wanted that to be the Lost Shtetl. I also knew that the story of Kreskol had to be about its rediscovery, reintegration, and withdrawal in the end. And I thought that Yankel mostly was the best vehicle to do it. I think that every character has a different reaction to what's happening to them, to this upended sort of world. And I don't think that Yankel's reaction is exactly like Pesha's. I don't think Pesha's is, her reaction is certainly not like Ishmael, her evil ex-husband. And I don't think that any of their reactions are like Rabbi Katznelson or Rabbi Sokolow. And I think that there are, other people altogether. One of the characters that I, probably worked on the most. I don't know if it showed, but I did work on it a lot. Is the chapter involving Spectre, Leonid Spectre, the character who tries to preserve the town, the Holocaust survivor. But to a certain extent, I think that the book, and look, I will admit that I tried to be as ambitious as possible with it, but I think it tried to follow a lot of threads of contemporary Jewish life and attitudes. I think that it it mostly comes down to a progress versus nostalgia, which I think is one of the big questions that we're all thinking about today. And I don't mean just Jews, and I don't mean even just in America. I think that's a global question that's happening today. I think that Osama bin Laden is a question of progress versus nostalgia. I think that we see it in Eastern Europe. I think we see it in America. I think it's one of the main questions that we're examining today. But within that, I think that there's all sorts of other moods and views and attitudes. And I tried to make everybody as real as possible and treat the attitudes respectfully, because I think that there is, look, I certainly see, I view myself as a much more progressive person, but I certainly see the seductions and charms of nostalgia and tradition. I think that those are important things, and they give a lot of meaning to people's lives, including my own. But that being said, I understand more the seductions of technology. And I'm not giving up my air conditioner. No way, no how. I mean, that is like, one of my most treasured items that I own, that I could own. So yes, I hope that answered the question. I hope that wasn't too rambling.
No, not at all. The other, just on the same lines, but not really. But I mean, by the way, I think it's, I thought it was a really interesting choice. When you for the guy who ran I can't say the word for post office, but
I think it's Paksta, but I don't even
pasta.
know.
Yeah, but I thought it was is interesting that he was responsible for, like, kind of, he was the Jew they appointed to, like, organize the town, and in some ways it was reminiscent of a capo. I think it's capo. Like that. It's like he's doing the dirty work of organizing the people of Kreskol so that they could be counted, and and God, and who knows what would happen to them then. But which I think is, I mean, at least that's how I read it, that, like, again, when you're, when the town, what happens to Kreskol, it with progress, right? Like, so, and what path are they really going down? Another thing that I thought was, I just wanted to ask you about was the names that you picked for Pesha and Ishmael and Yankel, and how much. I mean, I'm sure you put some thought into it. I looked up Pesha just to make sure that my Hebrew, which was right, but it's like, it means like a sin or crime, and and another my friend Bela looked it up, and it was, wait, what did she say? It was a deliberate rebellion against God and God's law. So it's just interesting that you pick those names, and and attach them to those characters. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, and Yankel isn't the that's like Yiddish for
Jacob.
Joseph, or is it Jacob or Joseph? But well, it shows how much I know. um, but actually, I think that Jacob or Joseph both work. Um, Ishmael was the one that was actually a name that I've had a lot of blowback about. Well, most people have said to me that they're like, nobody in a Yiddish speaking town would be named Ishmael, which actually I got prior to publication from. I did hire a couple of people to read the book in an earlier draft form and give me notes, and one of whom was her parents were born in a shtetl, were from a shtetl. She was born in a DP camp, and she knew the things very well. She was like, you cannot name this character Ishmael. But I always thought, first off, um, in the Torah, he's referred to as a wild ass of a man. As far as I'm concerned, that's who this character is. And I actually toyed with giving a more of an explanation for his name, how this person would be named Ishmael. But I actually thought that was a good thing to sort of keep, like, that pebble in the reader's shoe, and they could figure out for themselves, or come up with their own origin story for how he came by that name. Um, Names were very important. I doubt you can see from this angle, although maybe you can. But like right over here is my Yiddish section of my my books. I have a lot of Isaac Bashevis Singer books, and Peretz and Shmuel Agnon and all these other writers, and I I definitely looked at a lot of Yiddish books for the weirdest names that I could find. Some of them I definitely wanted to be Dickensian, like Spectre. I mean, he's a ghost who's wandering through this town. So let's go Dickensian on this. I don't mind. And some of them I wanted to have like a Torah root. And some of them, I mean, look, when my son was born, we knew he was going to be named Harry right from the beginning. We loved that name. We both agreed on it. That was done. But we couldn't figure out a middle name. And we were in East Hampton at the time. We go on our way back to the city, we go into the East Hampton bookstore, and get a book of names, and go to the jitney, which takes you back to the city. And we're standing in front of the jitney. My wife opens it up and she says, How about Leopold for the middle name? And I'm like, all right, we're done. That's it. Like we had it for like all of 4 minutes before, its use had completely terminated and we didn't need that book anymore. But I have this book in my house, and it's great. Like, it gives you the origins of names, and you could look up, Yiddish names, Hebrew names, this, that, and the other thing. It's fantastic. So I spent a lot of time prowling through that book, and hey, we have Google. Let's use it. I use I Google Yiddish boy names, Yiddish girl names, and all the time.
I guess lucky for you, you had technology, and you were not living in the town of Kreskol at the time.
Exactly.
I have other questions, but I know that it's likely that there are folks that want to ask it. Mark and Marcia, can I turn it over to you? Where are you?
Well, I have a comment and then a question, but I'm assuming, based on what you said, that this imaginary shtetl was someplace near Lublin, which was near Chelm.
Mm-hmm.
I assume you're familiar with that. My father grew up there, literally
Really?
in Chelm. Yeah, no kidding. And so,
well, I always loved the wise men of Helm and all of their over logic. It wasn't stupidity. It's often mischaracterized as stupidity. They are too smart. They have too much logic, and their logic does not stand up to physics, but it's only because the physics hasn't caught up to their logic. But yes.
yeah, and when I started reading the book, I thought you were going to do that kind of broad caricature of the people in the shtetl, and I was very impressed that you actually made them all real people, and went in a whole different direction. It was fascinating. I was curious how much research you put into it, other than the names, in terms of the structure of the Polish government, all that kind of stuff.
Well, I mean, look, I will admit that I am interested in contemporary Poland. I think that it's a current I, I have very strong opinions that what's happening in the government today is nothing short of outrageous and a tragedy given um, Poland's heroic struggle against anti-democratic norms prior to the last few years. So it's something that I've definitely paid attention to. I will say that research is an interesting question. I spent a lot of my life prior to the writing of the Lost Shtetl reading a lot of Yiddish literature. So I have read, you know, pretty much every word I could every book that I can lay my hands on of Isaac Bashevis Singer. I'm sure that's pretty obvious based on this book. Chaim Grada, Agnon, Peretz. There are just a lot of writers who I've read since I was a kid, and I've been very one might use the word obsessive about World War II in terms of reading, the history of the Holocaust and what happened in that moment, which I've always viewed as one of these um, historical watersheds, which you have to pay attention to be a good citizen. I think it's one of the the more important um, you know happenings in human history. So I've spent a lot of my time, a lot of my life reading that stuff. So when I went into the writing of the book, I actually didn't do that much research at first. I think that I um, got the idea for this book and didn't want to lose a lot of the momentum. So I just started writing it. And I think I'm certainly no expert. I would never claim to be an expert, but I had enough basic knowledge that I could sort of fake my way through a first draft without some sort of yawning historical hole that would sink the whole enterprise. Um, so I wrote my first draft, and then I started reading and filling in the holes and looking at a lot of historical books. One of my um, the single most valuable resource for me was a book by somebody named Yafa Elich, who wrote a book called There Once Was a World, which was about her shtetl in Lithuania. I believe it was on the Lithuania-Polish border, so it might have traded territory between Poland and Lithuania over the years. But it was a amazing guide for somebody who's doing a project like I was doing, simply because it talked about every single aspect of life in that shtetl. And it's something that I would highly recommend to anybody who's interested. Everything from the construction of the synagogue to market day to, matchmaking to everything in that town. She dove into and explained in a way that was really, really invaluable to me in my work. But there were a lot of other books that I also read along the way. I mean, there were a lot of books about the Holocaust. I think I mentioned the passages that I wrote about Leonid Spector. I mean, Primo Levi was always my favorite source about the Holocaust. I think he's the best writer about the Holocaust and smartest and the most introspective. And there were two other things. I mean, so I was at the great good fortune to be a writer at the New York Post for the travel desk for quite some time, which is a fantastic job if you can get it. I was in my 20s. This was before I had a child, and I would, traipse around. And when the new travel editor started, a very good friend of mine named David Kaufman, who's now the editor of Architectural Digest, started as the travel editor there. He said to me, "Where do you want to go?" And the first place I said was Poland, because I'd already started a draft of the book, and it was very important to me that I get some of the flavor of the country, speak to some people there, do that. And lastly, a big part of my research was twofold. I did hire a professor of Polish Jewish history at Sarah Lawrence named Glenn Diner to review the book and give me his notes. And Esther Goodman, who I think I mentioned earlier, who was born in a DP camp in Poland. Her parents were from a Polish shtetl who went through it as well and tried to steer me away from the rocky coasts. And lastly, and I'm really going on at length, and I apologize for that, I have a very dear friend of mine that I grew up with who's Polish named Iggy Zalowski, who I would constantly email and say, "So what's the mall in Kreskol in Warsaw that somebody would go to? What are the jeans that somebody would wear in Warsaw?" And the last thing I'll say about this was, for those of you who have read the book, you know that there's a big part of the book that takes place in a brothel in Poland. And I started asking him questions about brothels in Poland, to which he responded, "Max, I don't know anything about brothels and prostitution in Poland. Are you crazy?" And so, but I Googled that part. But anyway.
I want to just ask, Marcia, do you have a follow-up to that, or does Mark have a follow-up for that? I don't want to cut you off. No, okay. How much do you think the Holocaust, how much do you think of the Holocaust as another character in this book?
Well, I think of it as the ghost of the book. I don't want to say that it's absent, but it's hovering there. And it's funny, the Spector chapter, I said that it's the chapter that I spent the most time on, which is true. And it was also an addition. I finished a draft of the book, and you mentioned in the bio that you read that my parents are both writers. I gave a chapter to my mother, who is my harshest critic and most fervent champion. And in this early chapter, the Spectre, in this early version, the Spectre chapter was not in it. And she said to me, Max, you've written a book about the Holocaust that doesn't have the Holocaust in it. And she said, you really have to think about how that affects people, and that has to be in there. And I think she was right. And so it was something that it was probably the biggest, like, single change that I made from, the first draft to the draft that finally was accepted by HarperCollins. But it was an important one. And, I think that it had to have been, I didn't want it to take over the whole thing, but I think it had to have been a shadow that was, in every room.
He's such a powerful, it's such a powerful, I mean, all your work, hard work showed, because he's such a powerful character in the story, and he pulls so much of it together in the end, which I know there are some people who haven't read the book yet or haven't gotten to the end, but at least in my mind, he's, when we meet him, and when the rabbi hears his story, they make a huge choice at that moment to stay where they are. And so, and then they have to make another choice later. And I just think he's such an interesting character, and really powerfully portrayed. Minna, I see you have your hand up, so I'm going to turn it to you.
Yes. Oops. I moved it? No. I love the book. I thought it was very good. I'm wondering why you must have decided at the very end that they would stay their way. In other words, the Kreskol would remain a town within the forest and not go, as you have Leonard Spector's solitary campaign to protect Kreskol from the wider world with its savage, ruinous ways. Did you ever think that the residents would be in love with the air conditioning and the washing machines and the sewing machines, and would want to go back, want to go forward?
I think that some of them are, for sure. And I think that, there is, I mean, look, I don't think I could tie up, every single loose end. But I know that Yankel is taken with modernity, and, he's not returning to the farm after he's seen, gay Warsaw, not gay Paris, but he's you can't send him back to the farm. Pesha as well. I think that that's sort of what we get to in terms of the whole split between the Katznelsoners and the Sokolowites. I think that the followers of Rabbi Sokolow have accepted modernity. They do like it. I think that they turn when modernity turns on them. They're sort of victims of this hoax campaign against the town, basically. But they generally like the fruits that they've been enjoying, and it's only that that everything blew up, that they're sort of fall down that hole with the Katznelsoners, in my opinion.
So Eileen Oranger, you have to unmute, Eileen.
I thought you unmuted me. The name Yankel, I was going to ask that question as well, Rabbi, because in my history of the word Yankel, it was someone who was like a nebuch. He was unworldly. He didn't have too much up here. And at the beginning, it was very upsetting to me how the town treated him. Like he's a throw off. Go to the forest. If you make it, fine. If you don't, that's fine. And then I thought the beginning was hysterical when he's telling all, his reaction to all this modernity and the way nobody believed him. And then it got down to being very serious and very sad. I thought his whole life was so sad, that poor soul, going through finding the one that he loved and losing her and the whole thing. And I wondered, at the end, of course, you made it so that it sort of had a happy ending, kind of. But I wondered if you planned that in his process.
Mhm. Well, I'll tell you, Eileen, um, I, um, there's a Kurt Vonnegut quote where he says, "Be cruel to your characters, even the ones that are that you love, because you'll see what they're really made of." And I think that there's something to that. I think that I've always believed, when I started the book, that Kreskol could never have a fully happy fate. They could never be fully integrated, because the story of the Jews in general is one that's so pockmarked with tragedy. I don't think that I think that there are, one of the reasons why I think there are so many Jewish writers is because we're attracted to the history, because the sweep of Jewish history has so many valleys and peaks that you have to have no imagination not to be fascinated and follow it. And we live in America, which is a story of great Jewish triumph and great Jewish success. And Europe, I think, is the opposite. It's certainly, there is a Jewish community there, but it's the scene of the crime as far as I'm concerned, and it's a tragedy what happened there. I think the shtetl life doesn't exist anymore. It exists in those, like, in Borough Park, and it exists in New Square, New York, and it exists in the bubbles where it's been recreated. But that thing doesn't exist anymore. That thing is no more, and I don't think it's compatible with what happened in Europe. And I always felt that it couldn't be a happy ending, a fully happy ending. It wasn't like, as bad as some of the endings I came up with for the ending. I came up with some bad ones, but I thought that it could never be a fully happy ending. Hope that makes sense.
Judy Epstein.
Hi, it was a fascinating read, and I think from your introduction, you answered one of my questions, which is what inspired you to write this book. So, I mean, I think you're exploring the collision of tradition and technology. But I am still curious. You said your parents were novelists?
My parents were actually, my father is a mystery writer.
Oh,
But my parents met at Newsday, where they were both writers, and my mother went on to the Daily News and Ms. Magazine and the New York Times, and she had she started T Magazine, which is the Times' style magazine. My father worked for People Magazine and was at Newsday for 16 years, and he has written a number of biographies of celebrities, and written a number of true crime books, and written a number of mystery novels as well.
well, that's good to know you can make a living writing. But I'm curious, were you always going to write a novel, or did something set you off? And if so, what?
Well, I'll tell you, it's Judy, right? Judy, well, I think I laid a little bit of the groundwork for this book, in terms of, like, describing sort of my mental state and how I've been thinking about, some Jewish topics. But I'm happy to tell you the moment where I did come up with this particular book, which was, there was a book that I was reading called The War Against the Jews by a writer named Lucy Davidovic, which was a very data-heavy book, and a book that really delved into the mechanics of World War II and the Holocaust, as well as discussed a lot of the towns that were wiped out. And when I was reading this book, I did have a moment where I did think, almost, whimsically, how is it that of all these hundreds of towns that were in Eastern Europe during World War II, how is it that none of them escaped this horrible fate? And a thought occurred to me, oh, well, if one did, that would be a very interesting story. And so that was sort of the seed that, I spent a long time thinking about before I actually started writing the book. But in answer to your question just about my background, I've always wanted to write novels. I've always wanted to write fiction since I was a kid. And, I'm a little bit old to make my debut, but in terms of fiction, but, I wanted it to be something that I was, pleased with. And I spent, a good decade working on this book. And there were a couple of books that I wrote over the course of my 20s that were buried alive because, they weren't quite up to snuff. But yeah, I'd always wanted to write. I always loved to just sit in my room, make up stories. And I did a lot of them when I was a kid. And in my 20s, when I wasn't trying to, meet women, I was working on some of these things as well. And then, of course, settling down was probably the best thing that could have happened to my writing.
Thank you.
Sorry if that's a gross answer. I am gross. I am Max Gross, so I have to occasionally give a gross answer.
It's an awesome and beautifully honest answer, and I think one we can probably all relate to and definitely appreciate. So, I mean, I have unanswered questions, but I want to be cognizant of the time. I wanted to just ask you. It's interesting. You described Pesha as the heroine of the book. And, and I find her to be such a fascinating character, and really complicated. She's not totally innocent. I think, it's so interesting when she, her reaction to Yankel meeting up with the prostitute in the bazaar, and, like her anger kind of overcoming her. Like, I think had you left that scene out, she would have been an entirely different character. It added a lot to her story. And so, I guess I just have, what were you thinking about in terms of how you, kind of how you created her, or like, her storyline? And, I was thinking, like, did she have to be a prostitute? Like, why did you make her a prostitute? If she's somebody, in an earlier discussion about the book, somebody described her as a sympathetic character, because of the way that she was treated by the village. And then, what happens when she's, put to work in the brothel. But I don't know. And ultimately, there's the question of, like, did she have agency, where, or maybe she gets, she has agency when she leaves the village, but then does she lose it? Does she get it back? I mean, I don't know. I'll just leave it to you I'll stop talking and leave it to you to talk a little bit about Pesha.
Well, no, I mean, look, I think that with Pesha, I think that fate was unkind to her, in the Kurt Vonnegut way. I was cruel to her, certainly. I think that, I don't know how kind the town was to her prior to her leaving. I thought that the rabbis inherently took her husband's side
I didn't
until.
think they were kind to her. Did I say that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that that's what.
No, I didn't think they were kind to her at all.
Okay, good.
Just
I didn't
making
think so
sure,
either.
just to be clear. No. Okay.
I didn't think so either. I have to tell you, and this is like, a little bit of a, I don't know how inside baseball this is, but I knew, early on that I was going to be coming back to Pesha, and that Pesha was going to be an important character in the book, and that she was going to be trying to assemble some sort of life in Poland. And I was in the chapter where Yankel is living with Carol, and Carol says, "You have to, I'm going to make a man out of you. I'm going to take you to the brothel. Let's do this tonight." And when he lies down on the bed in his gutkas, and he's about to, have his first experience, it was a bolt of lightning to me as a writer. Oh my God, there's Pesha. It was just one of these, great surprises that happens to a writer when they actually think that they're going one way and then they go someplace completely different, and it works out perfectly. So that was sort of how she ended up as a prostitute, which I didn't realize that she was going to be. But one of the things that I always, thought was that Pesha's great attribute is that she's a scrappy person who is wily and who will take care of herself. And this was one thing that she got trapped in, but she also in the end extracted herself from this trap, and she took steps backward in the service of going forward. But I always believed that she would. I always knew that she would not fall victim to her captors in the brothel. That she would free herself out of that. And I think it was a terrible fate that she endured, but I think that Yankel also endured some bad fates aside from losing his love. I mean, look, being beaten up to an inch of your life is a horrible, horrible thing, and being alone and friendless and on your own and hungry, these were all terrible fates as well. So I don't think that I just punished Pesha, but I punished the whole lot of them.
You definitely did. I would, I want to bring things to a close, and I just want to say that it's interesting that you chose the name Yankel, which is what a lot of Jacob in Yiddish. And maybe you did realize, maybe you did, or maybe you didn't realize that, but Jacob is my, as many people from my congregation know, is my favorite biblical character. And I love him so much because he's on this amazing journey of making all sorts of mistakes, but also being, like having realizations at so many points on the way. Sleeping in the middle of, kind of like your Yankel, like sleeping on a stone, like with a stone for a pillow, and he wakes up and he says, "Oh my goodness, God is in this place and I just didn't realize it." Or when he's about to confront his brother again, he has this wrestling match with an ish. We don't know if it's an angel or himself or a mysterious person, but at the end of that wrestling match, the ish wrenches Jacob's leg, and he never quite walks the same way again. He's changed by the experience, and he also becomes Israel in that moment. He steps into his role as Israel and the leader of our people in that moment in a totally different way. And I think that your book and your characters, but especially Yankel, lead us on this amazing journey, and really help us ask a lot of questions of us when it comes to things that really matter. And whether it's the larger idea of progress versus nostalgia, which you talked about at the beginning, and how we whether we accept modernity or whether we reject it, or something in between. But I think that it also asks the question for me is like, can we really ever go back to who we once were? And that's the interesting, the open question for the people of Kreskol. We won't know. And and I would just say that And that being said, the other thing that we didn't get to talk about, but for my, for our friends who are here tonight, I'll leave you with a question. If you've read the book, you can think about it, and if you haven't, I hope when you do, you'll think about it. What does this book say to you about the role that your religious identity plays in your life? For those of you who are Jewish, which is most of you, but not all. What does it mean for you in terms of, how you look at your Jewish identity and the way, you participate in the life of the Jewish community, whether you're Jewish or Jewish adjacent, or, or just, a friend of our people. So, so much food for thought in this book, Max. So I'll just ask you to, if you want to, make one last, say one last thing before we go, and then we'll close things up.
No, I just want to say, how glad I am that Rabbi Mendelson, that you enjoyed the book so much. I hope everybody, enjoyed the book. It was a very long time writing. It's something that I devoted a lot of myself to. And the only thing that I want to hear is that people enjoyed themselves as they read it. So there was some food for thought. So I thank you for that. And did Marcia have a question, or?
Marcia, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I wanted to congratulate you on the AJL Fiction Award, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
That was pretty cool to see. And I love the book. But is there going to be a movie, and is there another book?
I'll tell you a funny story about the movie. So, and I hope I'm not eating into too much of anybody's time, but feel free to, get off at any time you want. The book that Rabbi Mendelson mentioned, that I wrote in my 20s, From Schlub to Stud, which was a book about dating, which was a humor memoir, when the movie Knocked Up came out. In case you haven't noted the striking similarity between myself and Seth Rogen in our looks. When that book came out, when that movie Knocked Up came out, I was working at the New York Post. An editor and I were talking. I said to her, this guy is going to do wonders for my dating life. To which she said, "Oh, you should write that up." And I, wrote this. I wrote this book. I wrote it up really quick. A publisher saw the article I had written about it. So Seth Rogen was, my first book. This summer, I had a deal in place to sell this book to the movies, and then American Pickle came out, the Seth Rogen movie. Oh my God! They were like, it's too similar. We're not buying it right now. Sorry, deal's off. But No, so Seth Rogen giveth and Seth Rogen taketh away. But I have faith that it'll happen at some point. It might need a little distance from Mr. Rogen. I will also just say that there is some theatrical interest. There is somebody who is thinking about it. The narrator of the book, which is something that I always thought was my personal favorite part of this book was writing the narration. Somebody was like, "Oh, that's a great monologue." It's been being passed around to a few people in the theatrical community. Who knows when theaters will come back? But yes, so there might be a future for it in movies or theater.
And you're writing another book.
So I had a meeting with my agent about a year ago, right before the pandemic, right when all this, when we were getting set to publish and all that stuff. And, he was talking, he sat me down for lunch about my future as a writer. And I said to him, I'm almost finished with my next thing. It's a book of short stories, since short stories never sell. So I have turned in my book of short stories to him, and he has yet to get back to me about anything with those short stories. But that is done. So I have one other book in the can. Who knows when it'll sell or if it'll sell? I have another book that I am midway through that I will be through with pretty shortly, and I have about 5 other ideas for books that you know, I have to have my yearly meeting with my agent later this month to figure out which avenue I pursue after these other 2 projects are out of my hair.
So, so Max, we are so grateful to you for your time and for giving us so much to think about. We're looking forward to seeing this book in the theater someday, and to I don't know, maybe we'll have to find an old copy of From Schlub to Stud and see and meet the 20-something-year-old. You shouldn't have told us, Max.
I totally shouldn't have told you about this. I should never tell you. It was my fault for leaving that in the bio. I knew it was a mistake. You told me 5 minutes before the thing, you've got to give me a bio.
See what happens, friends. They blame it on the rabbi.
I'm blaming it on the rabbi. I'm blaming it on the rabbi.
So friends, I know a lot of us read the book here already. If you haven't, of course, I know you're going to read it now. And most importantly, tell your friends, you know, about this terrific book, The Lost Shtetl. Recommend it. You know, if you read it and you loved it, post it on social media, you know, and let people know, because it, you know, I agree. It was a great read, and we're all better for having read it. So thanks so much, Max. So The Lost Shtetl, Max Gross, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
A round of applause for this fantastic author. And that is the end of our program. Have a great night, friends, and I hope to see you soon. Thanks for coming.